So the last Bloomed Talks tonight will be with Rivka Galchen. Rivka Galchen, she's a Canadian and American. She's between the two countries. She's a novelist, and she said the title of she gave me the title of her Bloomed Talks. That would be "What We Can Learn from the Future of Birds." Okay. So that's a promise.
Merci, and I'm very honored to be here, and I've never felt more sad that I'm speaking in English rather than in another language, but also happy. I wanted
that's fine.
Yeah. I wanted to say we're so accustomed to this idea that the birds are our future, just from the most simple concepts, this idea of the canary in the coal mine, and of course it's always a dark future, and it's always the vulnerability of the birds that we connect to, the sense that they are smaller, they're more fragile, and they're sort of the first ones to tell us something. And of course, in regards to a lot of the things that have been spoken about tonight, we know that birds continue to be this figure. They're the figure who has declined in numbers by sort of something like 40% in the past 20 years, and we look to them for their fragility. But I thought it would be interesting tonight also to think about them in terms of their strength and flexibility, which is something that all birders know and that has been sort of brought up in different ways by the speakers tonight. So I wanted to think about our smallest birds, our sort of songbirds, and our migratory songbirds. They're sort of about the size of this microphone or a little bit smaller, and they're much lighter. And some of the things that they do, we've known about this for years, but since we've begun to tag them, we've sort of found out that they're even more astonishing than we thought. We've found out that they can sleep with half their brains so that they can travel for like 2 weeks over an ocean without sleeping or stopping. They have all of these strange strategies for surviving. We've found that they can fly 2,000 miles nonstop, these tiny little birds. We've found that because they don't have time or the ability to stop to drink, that they drink their own water when they process their protein and it releases water. This is sort of how they stay hydrated. So just all these sort of astonishing things. And of course, always there's a question of why they're migrating at all. And this is also very suggestive for us, especially like in climate change. That's sort of one of the biggest things that's going to happen is people are going to be leaving and moving from one place to another. And it kind of changes the way we think about nation states and locality, which is so important and so essential, but at the same time, like not the way that nature thinks, and not the way that these birds think when they sort of are constantly kind of traversing 18,000 miles back and forth. So I wanted to look at a very specific bird, which I didn't know that much about before, called the godwit. So the godwit is this tiny little bird we didn't know that much about. And several times a year they triple in weight. They just eat and eat and eat and eat. Their liver becomes enormous. They should sort of have all these kind of terrible cardiac side effects that we would have if we did this. They just undergo this tremendous transformation. They become sort of like these kind of illegitimate bikers in the Tour de France, where they sort of increase their red blood cells and they sort of unfairly can breathe with very little oxygen. And then these birds, again smaller than this microphone, they fly 18,000 miles round trip several times a year. And they mate and they nest on the Kodiak River in Alaska. And I sort of feel like there's something very moving and suggestive about this too, because they can't do it anywhere. And when they think about conservation of birds, they used to think, okay, let's just conserve the spaces where they nest. Let's conserve the spaces where they mate. And they sort of found out it's one of the most interesting and devastating challenges, because you have to preserve the entire flyway, the flyway there, the flyway back, the places they stop and feed, the places that they mate, the places that they go back to feed later. And so I think the challenges that they face and are kind of interesting for their complexity, because it is more difficult than a species that has a very specific place it lives, and we can conserve that one place. They are everywhere. And so that's sort of my thought about the future is to think like, well, what can we think about the future of these migratory birds, and what do we learn from it? Not just what do we find extremely anxious making and depressing about it, but also what do we find potential and possible about it. As our friend was speaking about, like, the darkness is overwhelming and in a sense quite easy to see, and the light is hard to see and requires a lot of work. And that's why I sort of think of a certain kind of optimism that you see in these people who work with preserving these flyways and preserving these birds. They have that kind of optimism that's not like, this is my prediction of what I think will happen in the future, but this is my political and emotional and ethical stance towards the only feeling that seems useful in terms of generating a better future. So along those lines, I just wanted to come back to the godwits, who do this quite amazing thing. So they mate and they nest. So after they've sort of tripled the size of their liver and sort of like become like 3 times their normal size, and then they do this whole journey, and then they land near the Kodiak River in Alaska, they then sort of do these funny dances and behave in these silly ways as if they're sort of writing poetry and kind of putting on crazy films to impress one another. And it works, and they mate, and they make these little birds, and then they do this wonderful, this wild thing that seems cruel to us, but is also quite beautiful. So the adults, after 1 month, they leave them. And they leave all the baby godwits there, and they're all sort of there by themselves. And the parents have gone back to New Zealand because it's nicer over there. And what's quite moving is that even though the godwits have sustained a lot of pressure and narrowing of their food supplies and narrowing of their pathways, they are known for being a relatively flexible bird. And these tiny baby godwits with actually very little guidance and just the kind of history of generations. And I think it's not wrong to call it like the wisdom of the ancestors, right? Because in a sense, like, that's what they've carried through their DNA. They've carried all the strategies that have harmed them and helped them, and they have that sort of like quite physical memory of that. And they make it out to the coast, and they start eating like crazy, and they take on this totally wild journey across a kind of hostile ocean where they can't land, and many of them make it. And so that's what I just wanted to think about tonight as our sort of idea of the future and these fragile songbirds that are also quite strong songbirds. Thank you.